The night was cold and damp in southern England, the kind of mist that wrapped itself around every sound and shadow. A soldier stood guard near a row of trucks, their outlines barely visible through the fog. Except these weren't real trucks underneath the tarps and painted wood frames, there was nothing but air. Inflatable tanks, wooden planes, cardboard jeeps all lined up neatly as if ready for battle. From a distance, to the lens of a German reconnaissance aircraft, it would look like the greatest invasion force ever assembled. But in truth, it was a ghost army, created not to fight, but to fool. In the closing months of 1943, while Europe still lay under the dark shadow of Nazi control, Allied commanders faced a single question that could determine the fate of the war: where would they strike? After years of planning, arguments, and promises made to a bleeding Soviet Union, the Western Allies had agreed on one goal: to open a second front in Europe. They called it Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. Yet success would depend not just on strength, but on secrecy. The beaches of Normandy had been chosen for the landing, but if Hitler ever guessed that, if the Germans reinforced those coasts before the first Allied ship arrived, the invasion would collapse before it began. The answer lay not just in firepower, but in deception. Across the Channel, in offices lit by the glow of maps and cigarette smoke, British intelligence officers began to weave a web of lies so convincing that it would make the enemy see armies that didn't exist, believe generals were moving who never left their desks, and expect an invasion that would never come. This was Operation Fortitude, the art of illusion in war, a grand performance where truth was the enemy and lies were the weapon. The British had long been masters of deception. During earlier campaigns in North Africa, false radio messages and dummy tanks had tricked Rommel's forces more than once. But Europe in 1944 required something much greater, something audacious enough to fool Hitler himself. The Germans, through their spy network, were always watching Britain's southern coast. Every movement of troops, every ship built, every new airfield, nothing escaped their attention. So the Allies decided to use that very attention against them. If the Germans wanted to watch, they would be given a show. To the Germans, the logical invasion point was clear: the Pas de Calais, the narrowest stretch of the English Channel. It was closest to France, had good ports, and would allow rapid movement into Germany. So that's where they expected the Allies to strike. And that's exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. The real invasion would happen 100 miles west, on the beaches of Normandy. The challenge was to make Hitler believe that Normandy was merely a diversion, a trap, while the real blow was coming later, at Calais. In December 1943, Allied planners gathered under the leadership of British intelligence and the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS. Together they designed an illusion so elaborate it would require not just fake armies, but fake generals, fake radio signals, fake maps, and even fake gossip in neutral embassies. The centerpiece of this grand illusion was something extraordinary: an entire phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, FUSAG was massive: hundreds of thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, endless rows of trucks and landing craft stationed in southeastern England, facing directly toward Calais. In reality, it existed only on paper, film, and air. To make it believable, they needed a commander whose name alone could terrify the Germans. There was only one man who fit that description: General George S. Patton. Hitler considered Patton the Allies' most dangerous and aggressive general. After his victories in North Africa and Sicily, the Germans were certain that wherever Patton went, the main blow would follow. So, while the real invasion was being prepared in quiet secrecy along the southern coasts of England, Patton was placed in command of the Phantom Army. He toured fake camps, inspected dummy tanks, and gave fiery speeches to troops who did not exist. German spies, watching from afar, reported every move. Radio operators joined the performance too. For months, they transmitted coded messages, orders, reports, and supply requests exactly as a real army would. Trucks with loudspeakers drove around the countryside playing the sounds of marching feet and engines starting up. From the sky, reconnaissance pilots could see what looked like vast airfields and camps carefully built from wood and canvas. Each detail was a thread in the fabric of the lie. But deception wasn't built on props alone, it needed people. Britain's counterintelligence unit, MI5, had captured nearly all German agents operating in the United Kingdom early in the war. Instead of executing them, they turned many into double agents, feeding false information back to Berlin. Among them was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, perhaps the greatest spy of the war. A Spaniard who despised fascism, Garbo built an entirely imaginary network of sub-agents, each stationed in different parts of Britain, who sent reports to the Germans describing non-existent troop movements and supply buildups, all confirming that the invasion would come at Calais. The Germans believed every word. They even decorated him with the Iron Cross for his loyal service, never realizing he worked for the British. As spring of 1944 approached, the deception reached its peak. Every night, more fake equipment appeared. Real American soldiers sometimes guarded the dummy camps, adding to the illusion. Local villagers saw the strange activity but were told nothing. In pubs and train stations, soldiers were instructed to accidentally mention that they were heading for Calais. Even neutral governments were fed whispers and rumors that the invasion would strike there. It was a grand symphony of lies, each note carefully played to build a single belief in the German mind. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Hitler waited. His generals argued endlessly about where the Allies would land. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, now in charge of defending the French coast, worried about Normandy and demanded more troops there. But Berlin disagreed. The Führer himself was convinced the main assault would come at Calais. To him, Normandy seemed too far, too weakly connected to Germany's heartland. The deception had worked, at least for now. By May 1944, the real invasion force, hundreds of thousands of men, ships, and planes, was gathering in southern England under the code name Operation Overlord. Only a handful of the highest-ranking officers knew the truth. For the rest of the world, and for the Germans peering through their binoculars across the Channel, the Great Army at Dover was preparing to strike at Calais. Every fake tank, every false radio signal, every lie told in a spy's report, each one brought the Allies closer to success. And yet, beneath the calm surface, tension rippled through every command post. One leak, one careless move, could expose everything. The fate of the greatest military operation in history rested not just on soldiers and ships, but on silence and shadows. The night before D-Day, as the Ghost Army stood waiting, inflatable tanks glistening with dew, no one could be sure whether the deception would hold. Somewhere, in a bunker deep inside France, Hitler's staff still debated the same question that had haunted them for months: where will the Allies strike? The answer was already sailing toward them, hidden behind a wall of lies. The first light of June 1944 crept over the English coast like a hesitant promise. Beneath the roar of aircraft engines and the quiet hum of planning rooms, there was a different kind of noise, the rhythm of a secret that could change the world. Operation Fortitude was in full motion, and every man who knew its truth carried the weight of it like a live grenade. The deception was no longer just theory, it was now the invisible armor protecting Operation Overlord. In makeshift command huts and drafty hangars, intelligence officers pored over the latest reports from double agents. Each coded telegram that arrived from Berlin was a small victory. The Germans still believed that the bulk of the Allied invasion army was waiting under General Patton's command in southeastern England, ready to storm Pas-de-Calais. Hitler's analysts interpreted every scrap of Allied radio traffic as proof. The truth that the real invasion fleet was already assembling for Normandy remained invisible behind a wall of fiction. In Dover, Patton played his role to perfection. He inspected troops who were little more than empty uniforms and rubber tanks, speaking in the booming tone of a man about to lead an invasion. Every move was deliberate, every word carefully staged. To the Germans, he was the spearhead of the Allied assault. They had intercepted enough signals to confirm his presence, and German intelligence bulletins noted with certainty that General Patton's army would attack Calais once the weather cleared. Hitler himself ordered his generals to keep panzer divisions near that region, refusing to move them despite Rommel's growing unease. Meanwhile, in the quiet corners of southern England, real soldiers were preparing for the true invasion. They trained under code names, practiced landings in secret bays, and studied the tides and sand of Normandy's beaches. Few of them knew about Fortitude, and even fewer understood how much their lives depended on the success of a lie. Their world was filled with real weapons, real nerves, and the knowledge that many of them would not see another sunrise. But somewhere far away, men were crafting illusions so perfect that they might just buy those soldiers the time they needed to survive. The work of deception was relentless. Radio operators kept the air buzzing with messages that led nowhere, orders sent, supplies requested, schedules altered. In Kent, artists and engineers inflated tanks before dawn and packed them away by nightfall, constantly shifting their positions to make it seem as though Fusag was on the move. Wooden ships were moored in estuaries, their painted hulls gleaming under reconnaissance cameras. Even the reflection of light on fake vehicles was studied to make sure it looked authentic from the sky. Every detail mattered, every illusion layered on the next until fiction became indistinguishable from truth. But not everyone believed the plan would work. Some Allied officers feared that the deception was too elaborate, too ambitious. "We're gambling the whole invasion on a story," one intelligence officer muttered to his colleague as they watched another line of inflatable tanks roll past. Yet even as doubts whispered in the back rooms, reports from Germany brought reassurance. Garbo's messages were being received and trusted. His fabricated network of informants continued to convince the Abwehr that Fusag was fully operational. The Germans even began diverting supply lines and reinforcements toward Calais. The lie was shaping enemy strategy more effectively than any bombing raid. In Berlin, confusion reigned. Hitler's staff received conflicting intelligence about Allied troop movements. Some suggested landings in Norway or the Balkans, others pointed firmly to Calais. Normandy barely appeared on the charts. The Führer, already distrustful of his generals, clung to his belief that the Allies would strike at the narrowest point of the Channel. He saw the build-up at Dover and dismissed any other theory as nonsense. It was arrogance, but it was the kind of arrogance Fortitude had been designed to exploit. As May turned to June, weather became the unpredictable enemy. Storms brewed across the Channel, delaying the invasion. In that delay, the deception deepened. Every passing day allowed the Ghost Army to move and breathe, to grow more convincing. Allied intelligence even sent out controlled leaks through diplomatic channels, ensuring that neutral countries like Spain and Sweden carried whispers of the Calais invasion back to German ears. The trap was tightening, but no one could yet see if the prey would step into it. Far from the planning rooms, in the skies above France, the Germans were watching too, but seeing exactly what they were meant to see. Aerial photographs confirmed the presence of hundreds of ships near Dover. Intercepted chatter between Allied units indicated logistical preparations for Calais. To them, Normandy seemed quiet, almost too quiet. Hitler's generals marked it as a possible decoy site and shifted attention back to the phantom buildup opposite Calais. The deception had become self-sustaining, feeding on the enemy's own expectations. Yet for all its brilliance, Fortitude demanded constant maintenance. Every false radio message had to match the previous ones. Every agent's story had to fit with reports from others. One inconsistency, one careless slip, could unravel it all. The men and women behind the plan worked without rest: spies, linguists, wireless operators, and code breakers, each one adding another brush stroke to the masterpiece of misdirection. It was warfare fought not with bullets but with words and shadows. By early June, the Channel coast was alive with two armies, one real, one imagined. On the night of June 5, as rain lashed against the shores, Allied forces prepared to launch the real invasion. Across secret airfields, paratroopers gathered for briefings. Ships stood ready in the harbors, engines rumbling quietly in the dark. In the command centers, Eisenhower waited for a break in the weather. The decision weighed on him like iron. He knew that if the Germans shifted even a fraction of their reserves from Calais to Normandy, the beaches could become a slaughterhouse. The entire operation depended on whether Fortitude continued to hold the enemy's gaze in the wrong direction. When dawn approached, the invasion began. Thousands of ships moved silently across the channel toward Normandy, their decks crowded with soldiers staring into the mist. Behind them, the Ghost Army remained still transmitting fake orders, still shining its lights toward Calais, still pretending to prepare for an invasion that would never come. Even as real men bled and died on the beaches of Normandy, the phantom force across the channel continued its performance, whispering lies into the German ear. In France, German commanders hesitated. Reports came in of landings in Normandy, but Hitler refused to release his panzer divisions. He was convinced this was only the first wave of feint before the real invasion at Calais. "Hold your ground," he ordered. "The main attack is yet to come." For 2 crucial weeks, that belief persisted. Only when it was too late did the German High Command realize the truth. By then, the Allies had established their foothold in Normandy, the beachheads had joined, and the liberation of France had begun. Back in England, the officers who had crafted the deception finally allowed themselves a breath of relief. They would never see the battlefield, never fire a shot, yet their work had changed the course of the war. Operation Fortitude had done its job, it had fooled the enemy, protected the invasion, and reshaped history. In the end, it wasn't tanks or planes that delivered the first victory of D-Day, it was imagination. The war had turned a corner, but few men in Europe yet realized it. On the morning of June 7, 1944, as news of the Normandy landings spread through Allied camps, the deception that had shielded the invasion still pulsed like a living creature. Operation Fortitude was not over, its final act had just begun. Even after the first Allied troops had stormed the beaches, their survival depended on how long the illusion of Calais could be kept alive. The success of D-Day was measured not only in miles of captured sand but in how deeply the Germans remained trapped inside the web of lies spun for them. In London, inside the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Command, the atmosphere was electric and tense. Eisenhower's staff tracked the progress of the invasion hour by hour, listening to coded reports from Normandy and studying enemy responses. The initial results were promising. German radio chatter revealed chaos. Commanders at Calais were demanding orders that never came, unsure whether to hold or move. Hitler's high command was still convinced that Normandy was a diversion. It was exactly what Fortitude had been designed to achieve. Meanwhile, across the English countryside, the Ghost Army continued to breathe. Radio operators from the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group kept transmitting as if Patton's men were still massing for an invasion at Calais. The double agents continued their dance, sending messages filled with false urgency reports of reinforcements arriving, of new units forming, of supplies being stockpiled. To anyone intercepting these communications, it seemed certain that another, larger assault was imminent. Garbo's network sent a particularly convincing message to Berlin, claiming that the Normandy landings were only the first stage of the full invasion, and that the main attack would strike Calais within 2 weeks. The Germans, desperate for clarity, believed him again. In Germany's command bunkers, the confusion deepened. Field Marshal von Rundstedt wanted to redeploy reserves toward Normandy, but Hitler refused. He ordered the 15th Army, the best equipped formation in northern France, to remain near Calais. "The enemy wants to lure us away," he said. "The real invasion is still to come." Even as the Allied foothold in Normandy grew stronger by the day, the panzer divisions near Calais stayed frozen, waiting for ghosts that would never arrive. Fortitude had achieved the impossible, it had made Hitler paralyze himself. Patton, for his part, understood the value of silence and spectacle. Though he longed to lead men into battle again, he remained at the center of the illusion. Reporters were encouraged to photograph him visiting training grounds in southeastern England, feeding German analysts the image of a general preparing for his moment of glory. Patton hated deception. It felt like theater, not war, but he knew its necessity. His very presence, his reputation for aggression, had become a weapon sharper than any blade. When the Germans looked across the channel, they saw him waiting. That vision alone kept them guessing, and that hesitation bought the Allies precious time. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence faced an exhausting challenge. Keeping Fortitude running after D-Day was like juggling fire in the wind. Every false signal had to align perfectly with the next. The slightest slip could expose the truth. A single misstep, a wrong call sign, a repeated message could unravel the entire performance. The pressure on the deception teams was immense. They slept little, ate hastily, and measured success not in victories but in silence, the absence of German reinforcements on the Normandy front. Each day the Germans hesitated was a day closer to Allied victory. In the field, soldiers began to hear whispers about the trickery. Some had no idea that an entire phantom army had been protecting them. When the rumors spread through the ranks, many laughed, unable to believe that wooden tanks and fake radios could have fooled Hitler's war machine. But to those in intelligence, it was no joke. Every man who landed safely on Omaha, Gold, Juno, or Sword Beach had unknowingly walked in the shadow of a lie that had shielded him. The deception had been as vital as the bullets they carried. By late June, the results were undeniable. The Germans still refused to commit their Calais forces, convinced that the Allies were saving their main thrust for later in the summer. The 15th Army sat idle while the real battle raged hundreds of miles away. Allied code breakers at Bletchley Park confirmed that enemy divisions remained in place, tied down by fear and uncertainty. Each intercepted German message was a testament to Fortitude's brilliance. It was the kind of success no medal could honor, because no one could ever publicly claim it. The deception had to remain secret even after it had done its job. Then came the crucial moment. By mid-July, the German high command began to doubt its own intelligence. Normandy was no longer a diversion, it was clearly the center of the Allied push. Hitler's aides cautiously suggested moving the 15th Army south. But the dictator hesitated again, suspicious of what he called the Anglo-American trick. It wasn't until August that he finally accepted the truth, by which time Allied forces had already broken through at Saint-Lô and were racing across France. The delay had cost Germany weeks it could never recover. Fortitude's shadow had stretched just long enough for victory to take root. For the men and women who had lived inside that shadow, there was no celebration. Their success remained classified, their names unspoken. In the cluttered rooms of MI5 and SHAEF, files were quietly marked completed. The agents who had lied so convincingly to the enemy simply went home. Some resumed ordinary lives, others continued in intelligence, their accomplishments hidden behind decades of secrecy. Juan Pujol Garcia disappeared into obscurity, later rumored to have died, though he would eventually resurface years later, living quietly in Venezuela. To the Germans, Garbo had been a trusted informant until the very end. They never suspected the truth. The Ghost Army, too, faded into history. Its inflatable tanks deflated and packed away, its wooden planes left to rot in forgotten hangars. The props of war became relics of imagination. But in the silence they left behind lingered the echo of their purpose. Those lifeless dummies had carried the burden of human hope, of young men crossing the sea under fire while their enemies stared the wrong way. As Europe began to awaken from the nightmare of occupation, the scale of what had been accomplished slowly came to light. Historians would later call Fortitude one of the most successful deceptions in military history, but at the time, few people outside the intelligence circle even knew it had existed. Its impact could not be measured in battles won, but in those never fought. It was an invisible victory, the kind that left no ruins, no graves, and yet altered the fate of millions. And so, as the Allied armies surged toward Paris and the war's end crept closer, the curtain of lies that had protected them began to fall. The story of Fortitude would remain buried beneath official silence for decades, hidden beneath layers of classification and discretion. But for those who had built it, the radio men, the double agents, the artists, the generals, it would forever remain their secret war, a campaign fought not with gunfire, but with imagination, nerve, and the daring belief that sometimes the surest way to win a battle is to make the enemy fight ghosts. The war in Europe was drawing to its close, but the shadow of Operation Fortitude lingered quietly behind every victory. As Allied forces swept through France, liberated Paris, and pressed toward the German border, the invisible army that had once guarded them vanished without ceremony. The inflatable tanks were gone, the false radio chatter silenced, and the double agents who had spun entire worlds of illusion faded back into anonymity. Yet even as the physical traces disappeared, the echo of the deception endured. It had altered the way wars would be fought forever. By the autumn of 1944, the success of D-Day was no longer in question. The Allies had accomplished what once seemed impossible, they had breached Hitler's fortress Europe. But those in the highest circles of command knew that brute strength alone hadn't done it. It was the unseen force of fortitude, the lies whispered through cables and the phantom movements traced on German maps that had opened the door. Eisenhower himself acknowledged it privately: our deception was as vital as our landing craft. In that admission lay the quiet recognition that imagination had been a weapon of war, as lethal as any bomb. Inside Allied intelligence headquarters, the architects of Fortitude met one last time. They were weary, but satisfied. The charts and maps that had once been alive with coded signals now hung silently on the walls, their purpose fulfilled. Officers from both Britain and America reviewed what had been achieved. They had created a full-scale illusion, one that had not only misled Hitler but reshaped his strategy for months. The operation had been so convincing that even after Normandy was secure, the German army clung to its belief in a second invasion until it was too late. Among those who had worked behind the scenes, there was a strange mix of triumph and melancholy. Many would never receive recognition, their work would remain buried under secrecy laws. In intelligence, victory often meant silence. Garbo, the man who had fooled the Führer, slipped quietly out of the spotlight. The British government faked his death to protect him, sending him into quiet exile. To his handlers, he was more than a spy, he was proof that human persuasion could change the course of history. For General Patton, the war continued on another front. After months of leading a ghost army, he finally commanded real troops again, tearing through France and into Germany with ferocious speed. But the irony never left him. He had been the face of an illusion, a symbol used to trick the enemy, and it had worked better than any tank division. Years later, when asked about Fortitude, he would dismiss it with his usual bluntness, but those who knew him understood the truth: he had played the role of a lifetime. Meanwhile, the British deception planners, men like Colonel John Bevan and their American counterparts, began compiling the lessons of Fortitude into secret reports. The conclusions were startling: the future of warfare would depend as much on information as on firepower. The age of deception had truly begun. Across the Atlantic, the newly formed Office of Strategic Services evolved into what would become the CIA. In its DNA were the principles learned from Fortitude: the art of manipulation, the shaping of perception, the creation of false realities for strategic gain. In Germany, when the war finally ended, the truth about the deception emerged slowly, piece by piece. Captured officers were shown the photographs of fake tanks, dummy airfields, and the radio logs of the phantom army they had feared for months. Many refused to believe it at first. It was impossible, one colonel muttered during interrogation. We saw it with our own eyes. But the evidence was undeniable. They had been defeated not just by Allied strength, but by their own certainty. Hitler's refusal to question the illusion had sealed his downfall. Back in Britain, the aftermath of Fortitude was strangely quiet. The props and documents were classified and locked away. The people who had created them dispersed into civilian life, their achievements confined to whispers in darkened rooms. The war had been won, but their chapter of it was destined to remain unwritten for decades. Even as Europe rebuilt, the idea of deception lived on in new forms. Cold War strategists studied Fortitude's techniques and adapted them for political and psychological operations. The battlefield had changed, now the war was for minds rather than territory. For ordinary soldiers, the truth of what had protected them was almost incomprehensible. When fragments of the story began to leak years later, veterans were astonished to learn that while they had fought and died on the beaches, entire divisions of German troops had waited in vain for Patton's imaginary army to arrive. Letters written home spoke of gratitude to men they would never meet: radio operators, artists, and double agents who had fought with silence instead of rifles. Their courage was quieter, but no less real. The deeper legacy of Fortitude went beyond military triumph. It reshaped how nations thought about truth itself. In war, truth had always been the first casualty, but after 1944, deception became a discipline, a science of shadows. Intelligence agencies around the world began training new generations in the craft of misinformation, counter-espionage, and psychological warfare. What had begun as a desperate gamble to protect D-Day evolved into the blueprint for the covert strategies that would define the 20th century. Decades later, when the files were finally declassified, historians marveled at the scale and precision of the operation. They discovered letters, intercepted messages, and hand-drawn sketches of dummy tanks. They read reports describing how Garbo's invented network had convinced the Germans that 150 non-existent divisions stood poised for attack. One historian called it the greatest magic trick in modern history. Another wrote simply, "The war was won by men who made the enemy see ghosts." Standing today on the quiet beaches of Normandy, the magnitude of that deception feels almost surreal. The sea that once carried thousands of soldiers now laps gently at the sand, as if erasing all trace of the terror and cunning that unfolded there. But somewhere beyond those waves, in the imagination of the people who dared to dream up Fortitude, the battle still whispers a reminder that wars are not only fought with weapons, but with ideas. When the last surviving members of the operation were interviewed in their old age, they spoke with a mix of pride and disbelief. One radio operator remembered the endless nights of sending false coordinates. "I never fired a gun," he said softly, "but every word I sent was a bullet." That was the essence of Fortitude, an invisible fight waged in the realm of perception, where victory meant making the enemy believe what never was. As the world moved on and the Cold War began to cast new shadows, the lessons of Fortitude remained alive in secret rooms and classified files. It was a testament to what human ingenuity could accomplish under pressure, a story of courage, imagination, and deception woven into one seamless thread. And so, as history turned its page and the guns of Europe fell silent, the Ghost Army faded into memory. But in that fading light remained an undeniable truth: sometimes, the most powerful weapon of all is belief itself.